Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I'll be covering finance training demo. So what is Dynamics 365 F&O? So I see a lot of people asking what career they can choose in D365 F&O. So basically the D365 F&O is nothing but your ERP. ERP is your enterprise resource planning. So if you see here, it's a what is ERP basically? It's a complete business solution, right? So in D365 F&O, F&O stands for finance and operations. So in finance, you have your core finance modules, and in operations, you cover activities like your inventory management, supply chain management, and retail. That forms operations. So when we do a project, we do a finance project where you do only core finance, or you do finance and operations where you have finance and your operations together. So that's what we do in D365 F&O. Now coming back to the career, so in D365 F&O, there is two things in terms of career. One is functional consultants, the other is a technical consultant. Now, when I say technical, this is where your programming language like the .NET or X++ will come into picture. Now, when I say functional, there are two things as I discussed earlier. One is finance and one is operations. Now, in the operation is where your SEM consultant, your retail consultant will come into picture. In finance, this is where your people like having a background of finance like your MBA, your CA, or people with BCom degree and finance. So those guys gets benefit here. Those guys can look into career in the finance functional consultant. So when I say finance, the background generally, people should be able to understand the basic accountings. So those who are strong in accounts, or those who have worked in core industry in finance, performing your accounts payable, your accounts receivable, knowing the business knowledge and having the accounting background can pick up this profile, finance functional consultant in D365 F&O. So this is what I'll be covering in my training. So I will cover finance topic that will help the people to pick this profile, that is finance functional consultant. So what topics do I cover in my training? So let me just begin with what I do in the D65 F&O. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover. These are the agenda which I'll take one by one. So the training starts like this. I'm going to do from scratch. I'm not going to pick an already existing company, but rather I'll start doing everything from the scratch. So that is, you're creating your legal entity, then your number sequence. What is number sequence? How do we create number sequence? Roles and responsibilities. So how do you assign our roles and responsibility to users? So this is what I'll be covering in the org admin. Moving on, we have your general ledger. Now in general ledger, I cover like your chart of accounts, your currencies, the dimensions. So what is financial dimensions? How do you configure financial dimension and how it works in F&O? So this is what will be covered in financial dimension. Then you have your fiscal calendar. So how do you configure your fiscal calendar, your account structure? When I say account structure, there is advanced rules, so even that will be covered. Then you have ledger setup. Then you have your journal names. So journal names is basically how do you control your journal postings, right? Then we have accrual schemes. So this is what will be covered in your general ledger. There is intercompany accounting which will also be covered. Then you have cash and bank management. So how do you create a bank account? How do you create a method of payment? How do you do a bank reconciliation? This is what will be covered in cash and bank management. Then we have accounts receivable, part of your customer. So how do you create your customer group? How do you post a free text invoice? When I say free text invoice, that's an invoice without your inventory. Basically it could be a small service, things like that. So how do you post a free text invoice? Then posting profile. What is posting profile? How do you create a posting profile? Then your sales order process. Now when I say sales order, this is where your inventory comes into picture, right? So how do you create your sales order, or each steps in sales order, which will be sales order is generally taken care by SEM consultants, but there is an integration between your sales order and your finance. So each steps in your sales order, there's a counter accounting entry that will be posted, and for those accounting entry, that's where the finance consultant will come into picture. So as a finance consultant, you should understand what are the accounting entries that will be posted, so that will be covered in my training. Then your customer payments, the payment journals, how do you create your payment journal and post. So this is what will be covered in accounts receivable. Moving on, your accounts payable, so similar to your accounts receivable, that's customer. So here you have vendor invoice, your vendor payment, settlement and report. So how do you book an invoice, how do you configure various requirements within those booking an invoice, your payment, how do you link the invoice and payment, how do you do vendor settlement, basically linking your invoice and payment. So this is what will be covered in your accounts payable. Then you have your procurement flow. Similar to your sales order process, there's a purchase order process, right? So your P2P flow. So how do you purchase order? How do you create purchase order? How do you invoice? And how do you do settlement? So there's a process, and for each process, there's a counter accounting entry that gets posted. So what are those accounting entries? How do you configure those accounting entries during the purchase order process is what will be covered in my training. Then your fixed assets. When I say fixed assets, you have your master data setup. Then you have you have process like how do you create fixed assets, how do you acquire fixed assets, how do you post a depreciation, how do you dispose fixed assets. So this is what will be covered part of fixed assets module. Then the touch points with other module. Basically, when you acquire or sell fixed assets, you can do that from general ledger module. We can do that from accounts payable module or purchase order, or we can sell in your accounts receivable module. So fixed assets is basically center point which will have an integration with all this module. So how do you configure those things and how it works in the system is what will be covered in fixed assets module. Then you have your tax, basically the sales tax. So how do you configure sales tax? How do you post a transaction for tax? This is what will be covered in your tax part. So this is what the part of my training. So let me show how the system looks. So this is the F&O environment. So as I said, you can see here, this is your workspace. Workspace is basically a quick access. You can configure this. So quick access, basically whatever you need to address immediately, you can add those things in the quick address. That's called as your workspace. Then as I said, the modules. So if you click on the modules, all the modules of the environment will load here. So these modules will come from both finance and operations. So you can see all the modules here. So you can go to those modules which you need to work. That's the part of modules. Then if you see on top here, you see legal entity. These are all the pre-configured legal entity. So once we create a legal entity of our own, that also will come here. So this is how you can change your legal entity. Then you have your settings here. So you can personalize things based on your requirement. Then your notification center. Basically any notification that you get, you can see that here. And also as I said, it's very user friendly. Let's say you want to open some customers, so instead of going to modules, accounts receivable and customers, you have another option where you can just type your, and system will automatically load the option. That's how easy the interface here in the F&O environment. So let's say you go to the customers, here you can see all the customer details. So this is how the F&O environment looks and feels. So this is what I'll be covering during my training. Thank you.